November 22nd, 1942. Wolfsschanze, East Prussia. The forest pressed in against the concrete bunkers like a living thing. Damp air hung in the corridors. Mosquitoes droned against the electric lights, even though it was late autumn. Adolf Hitler stood before the map table in the conference room, his left hand pressed flat against the surface, fingers spread across the Volga River bend where Stalingrad curved along the water. The city's name was written in Gothic script. His city now, the one that bore Stalin's name and would soon bear his defeat. Outside the inner security perimeter, sentries paced in greatcoats. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke and the peculiar staleness of recirculated breath. The bunker complex had been his headquarters since June 1941, and it had aged him. Everyone said so, though never to his face. His secretaries whispered about it, how the man who had marched into the Rhineland with such vigor now shuffled, how his hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. The telephone message had arrived at 0400 hours. General Friedrich Paulus reporting from 6th Army headquarters at Gumrak Airfield west of Stalingrad. Soviet forces had broken through Romanian positions north and south of the city. Two massive pincers. They were moving fast, bypassing German strongpoints, racing toward each other somewhere west of the Don River. The message was clinical in its language, but unmistakable in its meaning. 6th Army, the finest formation in the Wehrmacht, was about to be surrounded. Hitler had not slept. He rarely slept well anymore. Dr. Morel gave him pills that helped sometimes, but they left him feeling disconnected from his own thoughts, as if he were observing himself from outside his body. He had stopped taking them 3 days ago, and now his mind ran in circles, sharp and relentless. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood to Hitler's right, chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces. A tall man with a narrow face and the bearing of a Prussian officer from another century. The junior officers called him Lackeytel behind his back. Lackey, because he never contradicted the Führer, because he nodded and agreed and signed whatever was put in front of him. General Alfred Jodl stood to the left, chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff. Shorter than Keitel, harder in the eyes, more likely to speak his mind, though never when it truly mattered. Jodl had studied the map all morning and said nothing. The reports kept coming. Telephone calls from Army Group B headquarters. Radio intercepts from forward units. Intelligence summaries from the Abwehr. The picture assembled itself piece by piece like a mosaic of disaster. Soviet 5th Tank Army had shattered the Romanian 3rd Army north of the Don. T-34 tanks pouring through gaps in the line. Romanian infantry fleeing or surrendering. German 48 Panzer Corps tried to counterattack, but the Soviets had overwhelming numbers and the panzers were too few and too late. South of Stalingrad, Soviet 51st Army struck the Romanian 4th Army. Same pattern. Massive artillery barrage, followed by tanks and mechanized infantry. The Romanians broke. Some units held for hours. Most collapsed in minutes. The front was disintegrating. By November 21st, Soviet forces from north and south were less than 30 miles apart, moving toward the town of Kalach on the Don River. If they linked up, they would trap 6th Army and most of 4th Panzer Army inside a pocket. 250,000 German and Axis soldiers, cut off from supplies, surrounded in the ruins of Stalingrad and the frozen steppe around it. General Kurt Zeitzler, the new chief of the Army General Staff, arrived at Wolfsschanze on the morning of November 22nd. He had replaced Franz Halder in September after Halder's arguments with Hitler became too frequent and too heated. Halder had wanted to pull back from Stalingrad weeks ago, had wanted to shorten the line, consolidate forces, prepare for winter. Hitler dismissed him. Zeitzler was younger, more energetic, less burdened by the traditions that made Halder hesitate. But now Zeitzler stood in the conference room with sweat on his temples despite the cold, and his message was the same one Halder would have delivered. Mein Führer, the situation at Stalingrad requires immediate action. Sixth Army must withdraw before the encirclement is complete. General Paulus requests permission to break out to the southwest. If he moves now, within 24 hours, most of the army can escape. Hitler did not look up from a map. His finger traced the line of Soviet advance. North to south, south to north, converging. How far apart are they? The Soviet pincers? Approximately 15 kilometers as of last report. They will meet today, perhaps within hours. And Paulus believes he can break through? Zeitzler hesitated. The hesitation was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. He believes he must try. The alternative is entrapment. Once surrounded, supply becomes impossible except by air. The Luftwaffe cannot. Hitler's hand came up, a sharp gesture that cut the air and cut Zeitzler's words simultaneously. The Luftwaffe will supply Sixth Army. Reichsmarshal Göring has assured me personally. 500 tons per day. Everything the army needs. Zeitzler opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Mein Führer, 500 tons is the minimum. Sixth Army requires closer to 800 tons daily. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. The Luftwaffe does not have enough transport aircraft. Weather conditions over the steppe are. Göring has given his word. The sentence fell like a blade. No room for argument. No space for doubt. Göring had promised, and therefore it would be done. Hitler believed this absolutely, or perhaps he simply needed to believe it, because the alternative was unthinkable. Jodl shifted his weight. We must also consider the strategic implications. If Sixth Army withdraws from Stalingrad, we abandon the city. Stalin will proclaim it a great victory. The propaganda value. I am aware of the propaganda value, General. I am also aware that Stalingrad is the key to the entire Southern Front. If we hold the city, we anchor our line along the Volga. If we abandon it, Army Group A in the Caucasus is exposed. The oil fields we have fought so hard to reach become indefensible. Keitel nodded. The Führer is correct. Stalingrad must be held. Zeitzler tried once more. If Sixth Army remains in the pocket, they will be destroyed. Not in weeks. In days. The Soviets will concentrate overwhelming force. They have been preparing this counteroffensive for months. Our intelligence failed to detect the scale. Your intelligence failed, General. My judgment has always been superior to the so-called experts of the General Staff. When I marched into the Rhineland, they said France would attack. When I took Austria, they predicted war. When I demanded the Sudetenland, they thought Britain would intervene. I have been proven right every time. Every single time. The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Hitler's voice had risen during the speech. Now it dropped again, quieter, more dangerous. Sixth Army will remain in Stalingrad. They will establish a hedgehog defense. Fortress Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe will supply them. By January, we will launch a relief operation. Field Marshal von Manstein will command it. He is our finest operational commander. He will break through the Soviet encirclement and restore the situation. Zeitzler's face had gone pale. Mein Führer, Manstein cannot work miracles. He would need at least 6 panzer divisions for such an operation. We do not have 6 panzer divisions available in the south. Most of our armor is committed in the city or scattered along the Don. To assemble a relief force of that strength would require weeks. By then, 6th Army will still be holding Stalingrad because I have ordered them to hold. Do you understand the situation, General Zeitzler? Truly understand it? If Paulus retreats, if he abandons this city, the entire structure of our southern campaign collapses. The front falls back hundreds of kilometers. The oil fields slip away. Our Romanian and Italian allies lose faith. The Turks decide to remain neutral instead of joining us. One retreat leads to another and another until we are back where we started a year ago. Except now the Americans are in the war. Now the British are bombing our cities every night. Now we have no margin for error. Hitler walked to the window. It looked out on pine trees and concrete barriers and rolls of barbed wire. The Wolfsschanze, Wolf's Lair, a fortress hidden in the forest of East Prussia. Safe from bombers. Safe from assassins. Safe from reality. I remember December 1941, Hitler said quietly, after we failed to take Moscow, the army was in retreat, panicking, generals begging me for permission to fall back, establish winter lines, shorten the front. I refused. I ordered every man to stand and fight where he was. No retreat, not one step. Do you know what happened? Zeitzler knew the answer, but said nothing. Jodl said nothing. Keitel said nothing. The line held. Hitler continued. Because I willed it to hold. Because I understood that in war, willpower matters more than logistics, more than equipment, more than numbers. The Soviet was stopped not by our weapons, but by our determination, by our refusal to accept defeat. Stalingrad will be the same. 6th Army will stand. They will endure. And when the spring comes, when Manstein relieves them, history will record it as one of the great defensive victories of all time. Zeitzler tried one final approach. General Paulus has requested clarification of his orders. He needs explicit instructions. Should he attempt to break out, or should he establish a defensive perimeter? Hitler turned from a window. His eyes were bright, feverish. Send this message to General Paulus. 6th Army will hold its current positions. There will be no withdrawal, no breakout. The army will form a hedgehog defense and await relief. The Luftwaffe will provide all necessary supplies. I place my complete confidence in the 6th Army and in its commander. They will hold Stalingrad. That is my order. Zeitzler saluted. His arm was rigid. His face was stone. He left the conference room, and the sound of his boots echoed down the concrete corridor. Jodl remained. After a moment, he spoke carefully. The Luftwaffe's capacity should be verified. If Göring has overestimated, Göring knows what is required. He would not give me false assurances. Jodl nodded slowly. He had worked with Göring long enough to know exactly what the Reichsmarshal was capable of, but this was not the moment to say so. Not when Hitler's jaw was set in that particular way. Not when his hands were trembling again despite his effort to hold them still. November 22nd became November 23rd. The reports confirmed what everyone had known was inevitable. Soviet forces linked up at Kalik. The encirclement was complete. 6th Army was trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep. The Hedgehog, Fortress Stalingrad. Paulus radioed for confirmation of orders. The message from Wolfsschanze came back within 2 hours. Stand firm. Hold all positions. Await relief. The Führer has ordered it. The first Luftwaffe supply missions began on November 24th. Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft flying from bases hundreds of miles away. They landed at airfields inside the pocket. Potomac, Gumrack. They brought ammunition and medical supplies and mail from home. They took back wounded men, frostbite cases, soldiers with 1,000-yard stares who had spent too many weeks fighting in the ruins. The aircraft brought 100 tons on the first day, 150 tons on the second day, 200 tons on the third day. Nowhere near the 500 tons Göring had promised. Nowhere near the 800 tons 6th Army needed. Weather turned bad. Snow, ice, visibility zero. Flights were canceled. Soviet fighters found the air routes and shot down transport planes. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the pocket shot down more. The losses mounted. By December, the Luftwaffe was delivering an average of 90 tons per day. Some days more, many days less. Some days nothing when storms grounded every aircraft in the region. Soldiers in the pocket began to starve. Rations were cut. Cut again. Cut a third time. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Anything that could burn was burned for warmth. Men froze to death in their positions. Wounded men died because there was no medicine, no bandages, no morphine. Paulus sent increasingly desperate messages. The situation is untenable. The army is being destroyed. Request permission to attempt breakout while strength remains. Each message received the same response. Stand firm. Relief is coming. Manstein is preparing his offensive. Manstein was indeed preparing. He assembled what forces he could scrape together. 4th Panzer Army reinforced with units pulled from quieter sectors. Not 6 panzer divisions, not even 3, barely enough to constitute a proper strike force, but it was all that could be found. Operation Winter Storm launched on December 12th. Manstein's panzers drove northeast towards Stalingrad. They covered 50 kilometers in 3 days. Good progress, but the Soviets threw in reserves. Fresh armies pulled from deep in Russia. The German advance slowed, stalled, began to be pushed back. Manstein sent a message to Paulus. Break out to the southwest. Link up with Winter Storm. Together we can extract the army. But Manstein could not give Paulus orders. Only Hitler could do that. And Hitler's orders remained unchanged. Stand firm. Hold Stalingrad. Paulus did not move. Some historians would later argue he should have disobeyed, should have saved his army regardless of orders. But Paulus was a staff officer by training, a man who followed procedures, who believed in the chain of command, who trusted that his superiors understood things he could not see from his headquarters in a freezing bunker at Gumrack Airfield. By December 23rd, Winter Storm had failed. Manstein's forces were too weak and too far away. They could not reach Stalingrad. They could barely hold their own positions against Soviet counterattacks. At Wolfsschanze, Hitler studied the maps and insisted the situation was temporary. A winter setback. Spring would bring new offensives, new victories. The general stopped arguing with him. What was the point? He would not listen. He would not change his mind. The decision had been made on November 22nd, and it would not be reversed. Christmas passed. New Year passed. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, 6th Army disintegrated. Not all at once. Gradually, day by day, position by position, the Soviets launched Operation Ring on January 10th, 1943. A massive assault designed to crush the pocket systematically. They had 7,000 guns. They fired 500,000 shells in the first hours. German positions collapsed. Units ceased to exist. Airfields were overrun. The last flights out of Stalingrad carried a handful of wounded and desperate letters home. Then the airfields were in Soviet hands, and there were no more flights. Paulus sent a final message to Hitler on January 24th. The army has fought to the last round. Request permission to surrender to avoid pointless loss of life. Hitler's response came the same day. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will fight to the last man and the last bullet. There is no surrender. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th. The message was clear. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Therefore, Paulus would either die fighting or take his own life. Those were the only honorable options available to an officer of his rank. Paulus did neither. On January 31st, 1943, he allowed himself to be captured by Soviet forces. He did not officially order a surrender, but he stopped resisting, and 91,000 German and Axis soldiers followed his lead. They stumbled out of basements and bunkers and rubble piles. Starving, frozen, defeated. Word reached Wolfsschanze on February 2nd. The last pockets of resistance in Stalingrad had ceased fighting. Sixth Army no longer existed as an organized force. 250,000 men had entered the Encirclement in November. 91,000 went into Soviet captivity. Most of the rest were dead. A handful had been evacuated by air during the final flights. The rest lay frozen in the ruins or buried in mass graves or scattered across the steppe where they had fallen. Hitler received the news in silence. He dismissed the officers who brought it. He sat alone in his study for 3 hours. When his secretaries saw him later that day, his face was gray. He looked like he had aged a decade overnight. He never publicly acknowledged error, never admitted the decision to hold Stalingrad had been wrong. In staff meetings over the following months, he would blame Paulus for the surrender, blame Göring for failing to supply the pocket adequately, blame the Romanians for breaking so easily, blame everyone except himself. But those closest to him saw the change. The tremor in his hands grew worse. His rages became more frequent and less rational. His trust in his generals evaporated completely. He began issuing orders that made no sense, demanding armies hold positions that could not be held, forbidding retreats that would have saved tens of thousands of lives. The pattern established at Stalingrad repeated itself across the Eastern Front for the next 2 years. Stand and fight. No retreat. Hold at all costs. The same order again and again. The same refusal to accept reality. The same conviction that willpower alone could reverse material facts. The Red Army continued westward after Stalingrad, slowly at first, then faster. By 1944, they were in Poland. By 1945, they were in Germany. And in April 1945, when Soviet shells were falling on Berlin and the end was obvious to everyone, Hitler still refused to consider retreat or negotiation or anything except total victory or total destruction. He chose destruction. The decision made on November 22nd, 1942, in a concrete bunker in the forests of East Prussia, had set a pattern that could not be broken. A pattern of rigid ideology defeating military necessity, of pride preventing pragmatism, of one man's refusal to admit error costing hundreds of thousands of lives and ultimately destroying the regime he had built. Field Marshal von Manstein would later write that Stalingrad was the turning point. Not because Germany could not have recovered militarily from the loss of Sixth Army, but because it revealed the fundamental flaw in Hitler's command system, a flaw that would repeat itself at Kursk, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, and finally in the ruins of Berlin. The inability to reverse a decision once made. The refusal to accept that circumstances change and plans must change with them. The conviction that will alone could reshape reality. On November 22, 1942, Adolf Hitler made a choice. He chose symbol over substance, propaganda over preservation. His vision of how the war should unfold over the reality of how it was unfolding. He never reversed that decision, and because he never reversed it, everything that followed became inevitable. Stalingrad marked the beginning of Germany's long retreat from the Soviet Union. Over the next 2 years, the Red Army would drive westward through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and into Germany itself. The Wehrmacht would continue to fight with skill and determination, but the losses at Stalingrad could never be fully replaced. The Sixth Army had been one of the finest formations in the German military, and its destruction shattered not just the numerical strength of the Wehrmacht, but also the myth of German invincibility. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical retreats became a pattern that defined the final years of the war. At Kursk in 1943, at the Korsischer Pocket in 1944, in Normandy after D-Day, and finally in the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler repeatedly ordered German forces to stand and fight in untenable positions rather than withdraw to more defensible lines. Each time, the result was the same: catastrophic losses that Germany could not afford. The decision at Stalingrad demonstrated a fundamental truth about Hitler's leadership. He was capable of bold strategic vision and ruthless execution when conditions favored him, but he lacked the flexibility to adapt when circumstances changed. His worldview was built on the premise that we could overcome material reality, that determination and ideological conviction could substitute for tanks, aircraft, and industrial capacity. That premise had worked in the political struggles of the 1930s, when his opponents blinked first. It had worked in the early years of the war, when German military superiority allowed for rapid victories. But it failed completely when confronted with an enemy willing to suffer enormous casualties, endure terrible hardships, and match German will with Soviet determination. The 91,000 survivors who marched into Soviet captivity faced years of brutal treatment. Only about 5,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest died in prison camps from disease, starvation, and the lingering effects of what they had endured at Stalingrad. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad became a defining moment of national pride. The city was later renamed Volgograd, but in the Russian historical memory, it remains Stalingrad, the place where the tide turned. Where the seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht was stopped, surrounded, and destroyed. For Germany, Stalingrad became a symbol of a different kind. A monument to the cost of rigid ideology. A warning about what happens when political leadership refuses to acknowledge military reality. A case study in how a single decision, made in a concrete bunker far from the battlefield, can determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and ultimately shape the outcome of the entire war. The decision Adolf Hitler made on November 22, 1942, was not reversed. And because it was not reversed, the world we live in today was shaped by its consequences. If this story gave you a deeper understanding of how individual decisions shape history, please consider subscribing. Each week we bring you untold moments from World War II, focusing not on the battles everyone knows, but on the decisions made in rooms where the future hung in balance. Thank you for watching.